Welcome to another session of Coach's Corner, where you're the world's favorite, or at least the most passionate AI coaches. Invite some guests to talk about everything around performance, developing talent, and just ways that companies are using AI and different strategies to coach employees and different, t- capabilities around the world, right? That could be sports, could be CX, could be anything. So super excited. Today, we have a globally recognized customer experience advisor, author, thought leader in CX, really revolutionizing CX through this concept of PunkCX, right? And more about the attitude and mindset of what it takes to deliver exceptional value, standout customer experience. Adrian Swinscoe is joining us today, and he helps his customers and he helps people around the world really develop brands, develop companies that both customers and employees love. And Adrian, I'm sure I'm leaving a ton of information out there. If you don't mind adding and saying hi to our audience, that'd be great.
Hey Dan, thanks for the intro. I feel kind of like flattered, and I feel like blushing. Um, what would like to add? You know, I've been sort of in this sort of focusing specifically on this space, the service and experience space now for nearly, well, I guess 17 years or so. And I'm just I'm really interested in. I get really frustrated, first of all, by the fact that organizations often get in the way of people doing a good job or actually get in the way of customers kind of having a good outcome. And that's always frustrated me. So I spent a lot of time researching and thinking and writing about how we can drive better outcomes, customer outcomes, employee outcomes, and business outcomes. That's really what I'm interested in. And ultimately, if we can get all three done at the same time, then we end up kind of achieving the sort of the trifecta. Um, and so I I'm just a researcher, an investigator, an agitator, an advocate for these better kind of outcomes. And I don't have any specific area I focus on. One way I'd sort of describe myself is when I sort of traverse the spaces, I'm wandering but not lost.
Curious, if you will.
Yes.
Awesome. I love it. And you said you were blushing, right? We've had professional athletes, we've had professional CX folks on, but Adrian, you are definitely our first rock star, or at least punk rock star that we've invited to
Well,
Coach Corner.
thank you very much. I mean, yeah, the Punk CX thing started like a while ago. It was literally. I mean, do you want me to tell you the backstory?
I'd love it. I
To
know it, but I'd love for our audience to hear it because I think it's an awesome story.
So the backstory to the Punk CX thing was that I was in a pub a number of years ago with a friend of mine, Oshin, and we were over a few too many pints of Guinness. We were talking about the state of customer experience, the whole sort of environment. And being a little bit frustrated with that, I sort of blurted out the idea. I wish somebody would do something a bit more punk to try and kind of move the needle. Now, I'm a fan of punk music, and I think probably after too many pints of Guinness, I promptly forgot kind of that sort of a flash of insight. But it popped back into my head a few months later, and I thought a bit more about it, and it struck me that if you think about the history of punk rock and where it emerged from, it sort of exploded out of the back of progressive rock in the 1970s. Now, progressive rock, for all those fans of progressive rock, was famous for its you know it's largely for its own kind of virtuosity, and it's kind of it was largely self-indulgent, and and like how many notes you could play in your kind of like solo, how long your solo could be, and it's all very flowery and stuff. Now, that being said, there's a lot of people that really like it, and that's great. But punk rock went, "Well, you don't need a PhD in music to be in a band. You can just pick up a guitar or a mic or a pair of drumsticks and just have a go." And that that evolution made me think about customer experience, and it struck me that customer experience was exhibiting some of the same characteristics as progressive rock did in the 1970s. It became overly codified, benchmark, framework, metric to all these different things. And it's almost in danger, and I think to many degrees it still is, in danger of being more interested in itself than the people it's there to serve, i.e., your customers. And so that led me to think, well, if that's true, then what would a punk version look like? And that led to me writing this kind of book. And the book is not like a traditional book, which is, 50,000 words of black ink on white paper. It's inspired by punk music, punk albums, all those different things, and it's designed like a fanzine. So it's all full color. It's full of short tracks, just ideas about trying to get people to think differently and to just strive for more and better kind of outcomes. And honestly, it was done. It was like an art project. It was an experiment. But it seems to have landed with people, and it's become this kind of brand in its own kind of like right. And now is the name of the podcast. Had a podcast before. I rebranded it. It's PunkCX-born, and so now it has a life of its own.
Nice. Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned is you don't need a PhD in music to start a band, right? And
Mm-hmm.
oddly enough, you don't need a PhD in human development to be a manager or to coach people on how to improve, which, it's kind of funny. You should, right? And you also don't need a license or a PhD to raise a child, but you should probably in
Right.
that capacity as well. But you have one of the core concepts you talk about in Punk CX is high performing teams, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
just companies that customers, employees love, but how to develop and guide high performing teams. And in your career and experience, do you feel as though it's more important when you're developing high performing teams to really follow and have a standardized like coaching system or approach? Or is it more important to really understand the individual or the team dynamic when you're trying to deliver for coaching or develop talent?
And so that's a good question. And I would say that my answer is probably yes and no. And I
Mm,
think I would say yes, it's good to have a standardized coaching sort of like system because it's always really helpful to help people understand what good looks like. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to um, have people become their own sort of almost your brand version of robots, human robots, as it were. And
yeah.
when that's where you get to the no part, where you actually what you want to do is you want to help it make sure that you're not treating everybody as the same, but you want to try and facilitate and build on the strengths and the attributes and the capabilities of the individual so they can bring the best version of themselves to their work. It's a bit like you think about sports, yeah, they have standardized kind of ways of doing things, but they also have tailored development kind of programs to be able to bring out the best in each in each athlete. And I think that's absolutely essential because the we're all different, but I think we've all got something to contribute. And what you want to do is give people the chance of one to understand what good looks like, but also to help them understand what they need to do to be the best version of themselves to drive those kind of like better outcomes.
Absolutely. Whew. Man, and the one of the things you mentioned, right, is this concept of human robots, right? And you don't want to coach people to be human robots, and if you overemphasize the system and the approach, right, you might do that. So individualizing that delivery is really important, and understanding the folks that you're delivering that training to. One of the things that as you think about bots, right, AI agents, and around creating the human experience versus this digital AI experience for customers, or even in developing, the folks who are supporting the customers. So as you think about it, right, and as AI is getting more and more into the contact center, how do we help our leaders and our coaches who are working with those folks and hopefully not creating more human bots and leaving that to the AI? What elements do you think are really important so we don't lose that human flavor around customer experience and CX?
So I think and I've always thought kind of this. is that I think there's a one of the biggest Achilles heel in all of this sort of like space is that I often don't think people have a really clear and when I mean clear, I mean kind of the granularly clear idea of what it is they're trying to deliver.
Hmm.
Um, you know, there's that old saying was like start with the end in mind. Um, Now that might feel really difficult right now because of the way the pace that things are kind of changing. But if you start with the human beings that, in terms, particularly your customers, and trying to envisage and envision kind of what it is that you would want your customer to go through, or to feel, or to experience,
Hmm.
and then work backwards from there, and to figure out where's the right place for technology and for humans to kind of to play the right sort of like role so that it fits with your kind of brand kind of promise. Because
Yeah, I love it.
if you ask people and say, oh, what's your customer service or customer experience kind of strategy, they'll be like, ah, oh, there's this, and it usually will be an assemblage of a bunch of
Hmm.
like buzzwords. But when you dig into it and ask them, say, well, how does that change for different types of customers at different points of the journey, and what's the technology and kind of human kind of mix in that? I think we start to stumble. And so I think the big gap is that what we end up doing is we end up trying to, in many ways, trying to change the tire on the bus that's already rolling, rather than actually stopping and going, well, let's kind of like let's figure out where we're going to go, and let's figure out what's the right sort of vehicle to get there, and do we need to change the bus kind of here, or then maybe change to a different vehicle kind of like further down the road, and so on and so forth. Now, that might feel like it might take a lot of time and effort. I think that's true, but I think it's an investment in clarity and probably alignment. And it's probably going to help with technology choice and planning and all of those kind of like different sort of things. And I don't see enough people kind of like do that, and so therefore it does feel like people are trying to just do things on the fly, and then they wonder why they don't get the outcomes that they want, because they're just almost like not necessarily making it up as they go along. Because I'm not questioning anybody's intent here, but I'm just thinking that it doesn't feel very strategic.
Well, when you talk about strategic, when you were telling us the backstory, right, on Punk CX, right, it started in a pub and a few pints, but then
Mm-hmm.
it became this art experiment, right, around thinking differently around
Mm-hmm.
CX. But then what you said is, I just became a brand. It was so authentic and genuine, and you're saying the same thing as you're thinking about customer experience. You really have to start with your brand experience, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a journey most people forget, right? What is the brand experience that I want to deliver? And then how do I create a customer experience around that? And then how do I get the vehicle to fit the journey? I love that. And you mentioned a few gaps
Mm-hmm.
in where the brand experience and the customer experience fit. I'm curious about maybe some common gaps or coaching gaps that you see companies have today, whether with or without using technology, when it comes to developing those frontline agents or those people
Mm-hmm.
who are engaging with the customers and those interactions to deliver that brand or customer experience. What do you think are some of the biggest gaps that the companies face today or they're not addressing when it relates to developing those people?
So I think there's one of the common ones, because so I don't think well, I think the reality is that most companies or most brands, um, and their support teams, they aren't they're doing quality assurance and quality kind of management, but many of them are not analyzing all of the calls that they're doing, because they're not using kind of the technology to analyze all the calls. They're doing almost a sampling of calls.
Right.
When we do a sampling of calls, yes, it could be a random sampling, but you're getting a bit of a random sort of picture. And so I don't know if that's yes, it can be helpful, but it I don't think it gives you like a holistic kind of picture. What happens if somebody kind of picks two average calls or two poor calls when actually the rest of your calls have been great? Um, I think we're moving to a space where we can assess more like 100% of all calls and how people are performing against all of those kind of calls and how they're performing against resolution and how the customer feels and style of conversation and other outcomes that we might want to build into that depending on kind of what the strategy is within that service. I think that's really promising. And also you can start to tie that back to what really good looks like for each individual kind of agent, and then they can start to see a more clear kind of pathway towards, well, what I need to develop this, I need to kind of think about that, and I can maybe use some other tools to maybe help prompt me or remind me of some of those development kind of goals as I go. I think that's really interesting. I think the promise of high performance or higher performance or better performance is really is there, but I think it needs to be couched in that where are we going, and I think that's and if you frame it in that, and then you know where you're going, then you know what skills and capabilities and outcomes you need to be striving towards in order to achieve that.
Absolutely. And look, sometimes when you're asking questions to guests, right, some questions come across better than others, and some answers back do the same, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's one of my favorite answers that I've heard. And from a selfish perspective, Adrian, right, you're talking about performance, right? You're talking about like what are we doing to personalize that journey and but also from a theme perspective, right? Or some of the core skills and behaviors. That's what sim training is all about, right? How do we deliver personalized, practice exercises based on the data, whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
sampling of calls or 100% where we can make it more theme based. So I love that answer. And if you think about, you talked about outcomes again for the second
Mm-hmm.
time, right? And if you think about from the kind of the Punk CX point of view or perspective or how you think differently and talk about building a customer centric culture, right? And you do that at the strategic level or the brand level. What does it actually look like when you bring that down, not just to the frontline leaders and managers, but to the day-to-day operations of an agent, right? And the things that they have to do in personalizing the delivery and the customer experience. What does that look like from a customer-centric culture for the day-to-day operations of a single agent in engaging with those customers every day?
So I think there's two things I would say on that. I would say that one is that go back to that point I made around about getting clear on your kind of vision and helping everybody kind of like get signed up to that.
Yeah.
And when you do that, then you start to achieve alignment, and people can start to think about, well, what role do I need to play in order to help achieve this? And then the second thing I would say about that is that what's fascinating, if you look at all the research, when you think about giving people targets or objectives, more often than not, when you allow people to set their own targets, when they understand where they're going and why they're doing what they're doing, when you allow people to set their own targets, invariably they set targets or objectives that are above or beyond what will get set for them. And therefore, if you give people ownership of those objectives, give the people a sense of control of their own sort of destiny in that sort of framed kind of objective, as you like, if you like, I think you can start to really give people, you start to get to that internal motivation side of things, right? Let's all get clear on what we're going to do, and then okay, let's all kind of get clear on what role do we need to kind of play on in that, and then let's think about what do we each individually need to do in order to play a big role in that, giving people ownership on defining their own kind of roles, because I think there's a lot of assumptions that swirl around in leadership and management around what people will do, i.e., they don't know what they're doing, they're lazy, blah 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 blah.
Right.
But I actually think, given the support and if you're treated with trust and respect, people will always surprise you, and it'll always go above and beyond. Um, Now, can I tell you a story of something that happened, and to illustrate this is it's a bit of
Love it.
like a left field example, but there was a guy called there is a guy called Ricardo Semler,
Hmm.
and he wrote a book called Maverick. This was back in the 80s, and it was about a Brazilian engineering company that he took over from his father. Now, Ricardo, by his own admission, is a bit of a hippie. And he didn't really want to kind of be that sort of guy that sat on the top of the company and tell people what to do. And when he took over, the company was facing some tough times. There was some tough economic conditions in Brazil at the time,
80s.
and logic, the kind of or if like the dominant logic would say if you're facing kind of sometimes you'd have to make some whole bunch of redundancies and lay a whole bunch of people off. And he was a bit like, I'm not really sure I want to do that. It was my first few weeks in the job. I don't want to do that. And it doesn't feel right for me as a person. So he turned around and he said, speaking to his close associates that he knew in the firm, he went and actually pushed it out to the guy that had an all hands kind of meeting, had an open book conversation with everybody in the firm and said, "Here's what dominant logic tells us: we'd have to lay a whole bunch of people off. I think there's a problem. I want you to go and solve it." And so he left it with them and he said, like, here's the thing: give them access to everything, books, accounts, kind of all these different things. They went away, um, had a big set of meetings about it amongst themselves, and then came out with this proposal. And the proposal was they were going to make nobody redundant. What they were going to do, they were collectively going to dial down the number of hours that they were going to do. They were going to shed some accounts that didn't seem to be losing money, but they were going to keep everybody on payroll so they could ride out this storm, get focused and a bit more kind of leaner in a bit more focused in their operations, and ride it out and then go from there. That would allow them to retain all of the talent and the experience, but also make sure that they shared some of the load of all this sort of stuff. That company just kind of then, because once they'd ridden it all out, morale just went through the roof, and then they started just they grew and they grew and they grew. And I think it's a really interesting example of um, almost like that wisdom of the crowd sort of idea, but trusting in people. And I think
Yep.
there's something really interesting in that.
Yeah. No, what I love about that too, right, is Ricardo Sandler, being this hippie, right, that you mentioned and self-proclaimed, he wanted to maybe do things a little different. And you're saying what he did is he trusted different, right? He
Mm-hmm.
gave that ownership and accountability to the folks that he was asked to make some decisions about and said, how would you decide? And it turns out the answer was probably 10 times better than anything he could have come up with himself if he did it. And one of the things I talk to people like, hey, why did you start SimTrain? And the real truth is because throughout my career in the same thing as I was developing leaders and coaching and all these things, one day it just dawned on me that nobody takes a job, Adrian, to fail, right? Why
Mm-mm.
would they do that? But yet, at one point in my career, half the people I was hiring were failing in the first 6 months, right? And so I just felt I was failing them, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that just hurt. It really bothered me, and that I had to come up with a solution. And I worked with the teams and folks, and how do we get that? And that led to SimTrain, right? Over time, we needed to give them some tools that they can build confidence and skills, and so that they could not fail, right? And they can
Mm-hmm.
do better, get there faster. So I love it. And one of the other things too that you mentioned is give them ownership of the targets and objectives. We've always given people their targets and objectives and
Mm-hmm.
said, hey, how do you want to get there? How do you figure out to get there? But you're saying also pull them into that journey too. I'm curious, as you think about empowering these agents and frontline folks and giving them more and more ownership, where do you think feedback, fits in, right? So you gotta they have the ownership, they're doing their things. Where do you think giving them that feedback, that reinforcement, as you're developing, individual contributors or even their managers above them as you're building out your culture? What value does feedback have in that process?
Oh, I think feedback is essential. I mean, when you were talking there, it just made me think about there's a there's a framework I think that Simon Sinek uh, talked about in his book Why, and
Why?
it's
Yep.
called this. It's MAP framework, and it talks about mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So the M and the A and the P. So we talked about purpose, and that's about vision and alignment and everything else. We talk about autonomy, and that's almost like helping people kind of like give them the flexibility and the control to to set their own targets and to manage their schedules and to do all these different sort of things within sort of like kind of bounds and stuff. But mastery is a an essential part of that too. Like you said, nobody wants to come to a job to fail, to be bored, to do all these different things. Actually, we have a intrinsic drive to want to in things that we sign up for. We want to be better at them. We don't necessarily. We're willing to work hard. I think we're willing to go through tough times, but we want to succeed. And being able to succeed requires us to learn, and learning is a function of trying things and acquiring new knowledge, acquiring trying things and failing, but then also thinking about why did I fail, and maybe taking input from other people about why you fail, whether it's autonomous sort of feedback or whether it's direct from colleagues or managers or whatever. That's all part of the learning cycle. We know this from being at school, right? You get given a problem, whatever the problem might be at school, and you try it, and then the teacher comes like goes, Dan, I think you can do better because I think you've missed. What have you missed this? What did you think about this? And what do you think about that? And you're like, of course I missed this and I missed that, and so on and so forth. I think we're comfortable with that idea. I think the way it is delivered is an essential kind of part of that, because different people learn in different ways, and different people have different communication styles, and we have to be attuned to some of those sort of things to be able to get the best sort of results. But I think the feedback as part of that acquiring the acquisition of mastery is an essential thing.
Yeah, and what I love about your answer too, you're talking about feedback and also giving some ownership in the feedback, right? I think you can do better, and then you're forcing people to think like, well, what can I do better, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's just a great technique. And Adrian, a lot of times, friendships are built in different ways and in different time periods. So when you and I first met, you challenged me to think about my core values as a business and as a person. And I really appreciated that. Although that lesson will never leave me, by the way. But it's nice, right? You get these interactions with people and you don't expect them. And that was something I definitely didn't expect that day, but it was just a great way to get to know somebody at that core level. And so, like I said, that was great feedback from
Well,
you to
thank
me.
you.
You're
Thank you. I
welcome,
mean,
man.
it's like so I've always kind of like, I've always, my primary focus when I'm thinking about this sort of like space is that, yes, I want to, when I see things that I think are great, I think they're worth highlighting and celebrating.
Yep.
And naming the entities involved, because they deserve the spotlight. But when things go wrong, I have no interest in naming and shaming. I will think about that. I will tell a story about that, of what can be learned about that. Um, but I'm not interested in dragging kind of people down, because guess what? Everybody makes mistakes, right? And it's
Right.
how we respond to that is essential thing. So when the thing that you're alluding to, uh, I think that the feedback I gave you was very direct, and you took it completely on the chin, and with a huge amount of grace, and I will just tip my hat to you on that.
Well, thank you. I mean, you definitely appreciate getting it, and then I guess, yeah, how you respond to it is you can either, you know squander it or not, right? Based on how you respond to, that feedback. So, one of the things I'm curious as you were talking to, right, and different habits, different routines, things that, an agent or their manager, would use in terms of, becoming more, customer centric. And I was just curious, are there things that you tell your leaders or agents like these are some habits that I really think you should follow or routines that you should kind of go down that path and really to encourage them to become more customer centric, deliver better customer experience or even become more outcome focused? Are there things that you suggest people think about or do inside of your organizations or with your customers?
I think that oftentimes people get as they progress in their careers and say get promoted into different positions, um, and then sometimes into all the way up to senior leadership, all the way to the very top of an organization. The problem that I think I see happening is that they get sort of further and further away from the customer. The actual the kind of in sort of Toyota management system terms, they get far and far away from the Gemba. That's a Japanese term, which is Gemba in Japanese means the real place.
Is it Karetsu? Is that Karetsu you're alluding to, or?
Is it Taiichi Ono was the
Oh yeah,
father of
yeah.
the Toyota management system, and he talked about
Yep.
and the lean practitioners talk about doing the Gemba walk. But in
Hmm.
principle, that's the idea around just walking around the factory floor and just observing things. And I think the interesting thing about that is that the Gemba in Japanese means the real place. So news reporters talk about reporting from the Gemba, or the police talk about the scene of the Gemba. So it's where the real stuff happens. And oftentimes, it's a long way of explaining it. There are oftentimes when people get promoted, they get further and further away from, in inverted commas, the Gemba, which might be the front line where your support agents are dealing with customers that have kind of problems, or their retail stores, or kind of whatever it might be, that interface with customers. And so I think there's leaders need to become more conscious of that and try and think about how do they reconnect themselves with that front line. And I think there's three different um, levels. I see three different levels of leadership in this regard, and how it plays out in kind of behavior. And the first level is that you've got leaders that use data to try and build that sort of picture. And I just think data informs us, right?
Hmm.
Then you got a next level where they will try and add to that data with sort of like stories and testimonials and all these different sort of things. And I think those stories can move us because they add context and color to those sort of things. But I think the next level, which is where they physically collapse the distance between themselves and that in the front line, is where they go out and seek experiences themselves, because experiences compel us to do things. When we actually see something happening in real life, or we experience something in real life, where we hear somebody distress on a call, or we see somebody in a retail environment kind of that they can't get their problem solved, or that something didn't work or whatever, you see that and go, oh my god, that's on my watch, as it were. And I think whether that's you go and listen to calls, you go and answer calls yourself, whether you go on a ride along with your sales kind of people, whether you go and do this, you do that, whatever, collapsing that distance between you and the front line to stay in touch with your customers and the real experiences that they have will give you a huge amount of insight. So I would challenge people to block out some time in the diary and to figure out where their gamba is, and how can they go there, and then how can they make that a recurring appointment in their diary so they can stay in touch. Because
I
ultimately
love.
it's about prioritization and time management and commitment.
So I lied. I told you that selfish one was my favorite answer, but I think this one is like because you're not just challenging somebody to block out that gambit time. You're actually telling them they will be compelled if they do it, right? So the data is going to inform them. The story is going to move them, which in itself is insane. But having that experience, that's going to compel them to really get better connected to the whole reason they show up at work every day anyway, right? And who doesn't love being compelled? And to love and have passion for what you do. This whole conversation has been amazing, right? So everything you've kind of shared has proven why you truly are a punk rock star, right? And so I'm really glad you joined us, Adrian. I do have this question that I wrote out that I want to ask, but it's like, it kind of feels weird to ask because you've already been answering this question the entire time, right? But if you had to give a piece of advice to a younger, more punkier, Adrian Swinscoe, looking to build a career in a very customer focused teams, what advice would you give Adrian?
Um, I mean, I would say to myself, don't be afraid to ask questions. And,
Mm,
I would invoke the words of Henry Rollins, who was the lead singer of Black Flag and most famously, well, the replacement lead singer of Black Flag most famously. And when he was asked about what does punk kind of mean, he said, punk means question everything.
mm,
I mean, it's the idea is like you're not in a destructive way, but you're asking if somebody, like, why does it need to be like that? Why do we do it like that? Can we do it differently? Just question everything.
hmm I love it. And by the way, you talk about Black Flag, and it made me just think about White Knights and Jack White. Is Jack White, who I think is an amazing musician, would you consider him a punk rock musician, or would you put him in a different genre?
I know. I think he's definitely he's right when Jack and Meg were together in the White Stripes.
Uh-huh.
I think their sound
Stripes, White
was
Stripes. Thank you.
they were very much influenced by kind of punk rock, but then they were also influenced by the blues and to some
Mhm.
like bluegrass and also kind of country and all that sort of thing. Their sound was, I mean, the sound that they achieved with a guitar and a drummer was ridiculous.
Insane. Saw him live a couple times. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. And so, Adrian, obviously, I know your favorite book already, or your three favorite books, and please feel free to share or plug those. But I was curious if you had some other ideas. I think you've mentioned two or three books just in some of your answers today, which were very informative for our listeners. But anything that you would suggest to the listeners around a favorite book or podcast, if you will, PunkCX being one of them. That
Well, I mean, by all means, people should to check out the books that I've written. I've written four, although three are still available. One's out of print because it was written a while ago. Um,
Yep.
but people should check out the books and the podcasts and all that sort of stuff. And check out my website, which is adrianswinscoe.com. And if anybody's got any questions, then my email and phone number and stuff is all in there, so they know how to get in touch with me. But the one book I would say I would recommend people check out is a book by a gentleman by the name of Rob Walker, and it's called The Art of Noticing. And what it is, it's a book, it's a really interesting book. It's full of about 130 different exercises to help us build our curiosity muscle. And it's the sort of thing you can do with your team, you do with your kids, you do with your friends, do it by yourself. Um, like a simple example, it would be a case of go for a walk, but imagine you are going for a photo walk. You say you're taking a camera, or and then you're walking along and you're looking around for things that you think would make good pictures. So you're going to be going, this or that, or no, 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 that would be a good picture. And it's a very slight difference in terms of how you approach it. You're not taking a camera, you're just taking yourself, but you're training yourself to look at things differently. rather than just walking along. You're looking at things and going, oh, would that make a good picture? Would that make a good picture? And I think curiosity is can be a superpower. And I wish that we were more curious about the things and the people around us and the stuff that we get told um, on the news and all of those different sort of things. Because there's so many different ways to see things. And I think if we take a little bit of time to see differently, I think we'd all do better.
Right. I always tell, by the way, I always feel following up on your answers because you end them in such a way that following up on them just kind of kills the ending. So, sorry about that, Adrian. But
That's
yeah,
okay.
I always tell salespeople that, hey, discovery is the superpower of selling, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not the presentation, the pitch. It's genuinely caring about your prospect in a way that you want to learn more, right? It's actually one of the reasons I started Coach's Corner is, hey, can I spend 30 minutes and just ask people questions about themselves and how much are you going to learn? And today, the answer is a ton. And the theme today, I feel as though it's an understated theme of caring that you're talking about, right? This genuine curiosity, the Rob Walker, The Art of Noticing, the advice to a younger Adrian, ask questions, right? Be present in the Gamba, right? All of these things are just like, how do you care about the people you work with and the work that you do? And it comes out in spades in today's conversation and in your books and your podcast, Adrian. I really appreciate you coming today. I appreciate you
Thank you.
sharing all your expertise with our listeners. So thank you so much.
It's been my absolute pleasure. So thank you so much, Dan.